I got fascinated by the Woodside story because of the emphasis, really, that the climate movement decided to put on Woodside.
Woodside, shame! Shame, Woodside, shame!
Marian Wilkinson has been reporting on climate and energy policy for decades and has recently turned her attention to Australia's fossil fuel giant Woodside. Last year, the government approved Woodside's plans to keep its North West Shelf project producing gas out to 2070.
We've always said with Australia's fossil fuel exports, whether they're coal or liquid natural gas, LNG, that that's the responsibility of our customers under the Paris Agreement. And in fact, I heard Murray Watt just talking on your podcast about that.
I guess the way the world has approached dealing with climate change and greenhouse emissions, particularly through the Paris Agreement, is to say that every country who's a signatory to that agreement needs to reduce the emissions that it emits in their own country.
But things are different now. The climate emergency is such that we actually need to seriously examine what we're doing about our customers' emissions when we send out all these fossil fuels to the rest of the world. That's why I was interested in the Woodside story.
I'm Ruby Jones, and you're listening to 7am. Today, Walkley Award-winning journalist and author of the Quarterly Essay Woodside versus the Planet, Marian Wilkinson, on how one company captured the country and convinced us that gas is necessary as the world transitions away from fossil fuels. It's Thursday, January 8, and this episode was originally published in September. Marian, this is a pivotal moment for the energy giant Woodside, and I want to start by talking about the company's recent annual general meeting. You were there, so what happened?
Well, it was a bit of a surprise because I did know that the annual general meetings of Woodside had been quite fraught affairs for the last few years. The level of security really surprised me around the Crown Casino ballroom area in Perth, which is where it was being held. There was security guards absolutely everywhere. It was like going to the airport, bags checked, the whole box and dice. Nevertheless, the climate activists came in there, no doubt on proxies from other shareholders, blowing very loud whistles, which they later said was blowing the whistle on Meg O'Neill, the climate criminal.
It's very childish to stand up and shout, but having a few people stand up and heckle and blow whistles doesn't change our resolve. It doesn't change our beliefs.
But what I was particularly interested in was whether, in a broader sense, the shareholders were still questioning the leadership of Woodside on their climate plan. And I think some of the heat has gone out of the shareholder concern about fossil fuel businesses. And I think there's a feeling, certainly in financial circles, that the Trump administration has given the industry a big break. But I don't think that actually changes the long-term outlook for companies like Woodside. I think they are still going to be under enormous pressure because at the end of the day, you cannot get around the science of climate change.
You mentioned Meg O'Neill. So she's been the CEO of Woodside for the past 4 years. During that time, the company got approval to expand its gas production out to 2070. So it seems like Meg O'Neill is doing quite a good job of what she's being paid to do, would you say?
I think she's doing a very good job at the moment for what the board wants her to do. If we look at what's happened in the last 4 years, she's managed to ram through the Scarborough project. It's meant expanding their Pluto gas processing plant on the Burrup Peninsula. She's got both the WA government and the federal government on side with the extension of the big gas plant up there, the North West Shelf plant. And she is now ploughing on with trying to feed gas into that North West Shelf plant from an expansion with some new gas fields in what's called the Browse Basin up there. So I think you'd have to say in the short term she's been very successful.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about her rise to that job? Where did she come from? How did she become the CEO?
Well, she's basically been an Exxon person all her life. But the part of her career that really interested me was that she went to headquarters around the time of the Paris Agreement, which was 2015, 2016, to work for the Exxon chief executive. And I think she would have been there right at the time of one of the biggest original shareholder revolts internally against Exxon by climate activists.
A climate activist group has targeted ExxonMobil with a shareholder resolution calling for deeper cuts in its carbon emissions. Dutch group Follow This has urged the US energy giant to publish targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the burning of fossil fuels sold to customers.
So she really knows the MO of climate activism and climate shareholder activism.
And you got an interview with her recently. How hard was it to secure that and how did it go?
Look, she was quite forthcoming in the end, and I think she was very keen to put the line of the company. She is absolutely determined, I think, to press the case that the WA Labor government and the federal Albanese government are pressing, that what Woodside is doing by exporting LNG is helping to decarbonise our Asian neighbours.
And we should not be regressing. We should instead be extending access to electricity to the hundreds of millions of people in the developing world who still live without it. To do that, we need new supplies of affordable and reliable energy. But we also need to decarbonise.
It's a claim that's been running for well over a decade since the Paris Agreement was struck, but it is now a claim that a lot of countries and companies are hanging their hats on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so does it hold up?
I think it's getting really questionable now. On the one hand, we're seeing this rise in renewables, and I think that the instinct of the companies like Woodside will be to try their hardest to hold on to their market share and to hold on to their customers. And that means that they're going to be really pressuring governments like the Australian government to stand by this thesis that they're helping decarbonise the world, when really we want to look at whether that amount of LNG going into the market at the same time of the really rapid rise in renewables, that actually the grab for market share by the gas companies will hinder the transition rather than help it.
Coming up, what the government gets out of its friendship with Woodside.
The Australian government has stated its support for the gas industry and has provided strong reassurances that Australia is not quietly quitting its LNG industry. Woodside is certainly not quietly quitting. We are deliberately delivering.
So, Marian, I want to drill down a bit more on the relationship between Woodside and both the federal government and WA state government, because it seems like the government's rhetoric on gas and the approvals that they're granting, they are all in line with Woodside's ambitions as a company. So what did those governments get out of this relationship?
I think the success of Woodside is inherently baked into the psyche of Australia's main political parties. I think it was an unbelievably ambitious, important project right at the beginning. When it started in the 1980s, I mean, it was Australia's first LNG plant. It opened the door for the other big LNG players to come to Australia, certainly in its original thinking. the domestic gas it supplied for WA was very important to that state, both for industry and for the public. So on a simple level, there is a bit of tax and export income. Critically for both governments, there's jobs, and that is a huge issue in WA. That means seats, electoral seats. That means political support in the Labor Party, in the unions. That is a really big deal. It's backed by Kerry Stokes, who's the most important media proprietor in WA. So on so many different levels, both the state and federal governments, whether they're Liberal or Labor, they are intimately tied up with the future of Woodside. But neither the company nor the governments want to look ahead to what is actually happening in the energy transition. So we hear about the vital critical minerals industry all the time. These are the minerals that are going to help build the energy transition. And there's been a sleight of hand that somehow these critical minerals projects are going to be fueled by green energy. But if you spend any time in Western Australia, people talk largely about gas fueling that industry. And this is why Western Australia's emissions should be allowed to go up so they can help with the critical minerals industry and so they can help decarbonise the world, even though that state's emissions are going up. To me, both the government and the gas companies in WA, they're a million miles away from what the climate movement is thinking. And that gap, I think, is untenable.
Yeah, do you think that is a problem for the federal government? Because it seems like staking its reputation on being a gas exporter and also investing in things like critical minerals is one thing, but is that enough of a benefit for the federal government to justify continuing to support Woodside in the way that it does?
I think that's the really critical question. And I think the problem is we're trying to answer that question without realistic data about what is going on in the decarbonisation of Asia. So I keep hearing this mantra from the companies and from the governments that we're decarbonising Asia, therefore we're helping decarbonise the world. Once you start picking this apart, the arguments become a lot more complicated. If you look at a country like Japan, Japan is and has been, since more or less the time of the Paris Agreement, building its own gas empire to re-export gas around the world and to trade gas around the world. So I think a lot of Australians believe we're exporting to Japan so they can keep the lights on in Tokyo and keep Japanese people warm. But actually, Japan is also becoming a major global gas trader. And also, if we're saying, well, we're going to let our customers deal with the emissions from burning our gas, Japan might have a net zero by 2050 target, but does Cambodia, does the Philippines, does Vietnam? So the minute you start opening up this question, it becomes quite messy and quite complicated. And I guess if this is going to be the rationale, let's get some real information on it that is not just the information put out by the gas companies.
And so given the international energy market, the changes you're describing there, and the growing climate protest movement here in Australia that is becoming more focused on Woodside, how secure do you think the company's future is?
I think in the short term, Meg O'Neill's future is very secure, and I think the board is backing her. I think while the climate movement's actions against Woodside have pretty much been unsuccessful in actually stopping the projects to date, I think a far bigger question is the global pressures that will be on Australia. One, from the speed of the energy transition. But I think probably more importantly, it's going to be the pressure of the impact of climate change on Australia itself from the current global emissions. We are now looking at serious problems for the Great Barrier Reef's survival, in our lifetime. And I think in the shorter term, there is a serious campaign that will happen around the overhaul of Australia's environmental laws. I think a lot of people in the climate movement are saying there has to be a climate trigger in those laws. And I think the reason they have to be on the table is that Australians know that it's not just the emissions at home that impact their lives with climate change. They know what is impacting their life is global emissions. You can't just deal with your emissions at home and say that you're a responsible climate actor if at the same time you are trying to have your industries profit from fossil fuel exports without saying we're going to take on the hard yards, which is how we provide affordable, renewable energy for industry that works.
Well, Marian, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Ruby.
You can read Marian Wilkinson's quarterly essay, Woodside versus the Planet, at quarterlyessay.com.au. Thanks for listening. Tomorrow I'm bringing you a two-part series about Crocs. Darwin's crocodile farms supply some of the world's most exclusive fashion houses. But what's behind this booming $100 million industry is shocking. Animals being kept in cramped conditions and being killed in drawn-out processes. Indigenous people who say they're being ripped off for dangerous work, and claims of conservation by a scientist with a sordid criminal history. It's a story that has stayed with me since we first published it last year. I'm Ruby Jones. This is 7am. Thanks for listening.